You are listening.
You're listening.
You're listening.
You're listening
To a TVO Today.
TVO Today.
to a TVO Today.
TVO Today
Podcast.
The following podcast contains coarse language, descriptions of violence, and sensitive themes which may not be suitable for younger audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Arise, ye who refuse to be slaves. With our very flesh and blood, let us build our new great wall. The Chinese nation faces its greatest danger. Everybody must roar their defiance. Arise, arise, arise. Millions of hearts with one mind. Brave the enemy's gunfire. March on. Brave the enemy's gunfire. March on. What you're hearing is the Chinese national anthem, entitled March of the Volunteers. If your immediate thought is that this sounds more like a soldier's glorious march to war rather than an anthem, you wouldn't be wrong. Originally composed in 1935, it tells the story of China's fight against Japanese invaders in northeast China. It was a message of strength, determination, and sacrifice for a free and liberated China. Today, that same national anthem is still used, only the enemy has changed.
Heavy police, regular stops, a sense they're always watching.
For years, the Chinese government has conducted a brutal crackdown on Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims.
A BBC investigation has found evidence that China's policy is being used as a method of uprooting and assimilating the population.
The persecution of this population and that these actions constitute genocide.
China is believed to have put more than 1 million Uyghurs in prison-like camps.
For the last year, I've been trying to determine the location and status of one man. He came to Canada as a refugee and became a citizen, but China thinks he's a terrorist, a separatist, and someone who endangered their country by leaking state secrets. His name is Huseyin Celil. He's been locked up in a Chinese prison since 2006, and no one has heard from him in the last 7 years. I only learned about this case a couple of years ago, but I've known about Uyghur Muslims' persecution in Xinjiang for a lot longer, and I've always wanted to know more. Plus, I just did an investigation into awful prison practices here in Ontario, so naively I thought to myself, maybe I can find them. How hard could it be?
Canadian Citizen Services, hello, bonjour.
Hi there. I'm a reporter for TVO. I'm calling to get any information about a man named Huseyin Celil.
I mean, it's a bold endeavor.
We're trying to find out how's he bearing up, how's his health, and part of that is, of course, making sure he's still alive.
I don't want to say too much because he's still there, so I should be careful, I suppose, about revealing too much here.
It's not enough just to raise a case. You need a strategy.
I feel very sad when I wasn't able to secure his release.
I think it's worth trying. I mean, if I were in your shoes, I think I would try this.
How paranoid should we be?
They will play dirty.
Hey guys, I think I'm bebeing followed.
It could also mean you've been hacker compromised.
Now I lost a connection from the VPN.
Oh, what?
不是，我就问一下，你是不是脑子有问题呢？拿这个电话给我打，然后还问的是一个维吾尔族人，你觉得合适吗？
Yeah. Trying to find more about Huseyin Celil has been difficult, but not for the reasons I had expected. And I don't want you to think that this was just a fool's errand, though. I think you'll want to be on the ride for this one, because the stops we made along the way answered some major questions. Like, why has Canada failed to bring him home? How does a Canadian just disappear abroad without any recourse? And which doors do I need to knock on to find the man we're looking for? I'm Yusuf Zine, and this is Extradition, the search for Huseyin Celil. Chapter 1. Someone named Guler Huseyin Celil was born on March 1st, 1969, on a small farm in Xinjiang province, in northwestern China. Huseyin was the second youngest of 9 children. He wasn't born into wealth by any stretch. His parents were cotton and wheat farmers, earning the equivalent of 500 Canadian dollars a year. At the age of 13, Huseyin graduated from elementary school. Instead of joining his family on the farm, he moved to the nearby city of Kashgar to continue his religious studies and become an imam. He became the first in his family to study the Quran.
When I was in my country in Kashgar city, we used to study together. At the time I was 18 years old. Like Huseyin Celil was around 16. He was a little bit younger than me.
This is Abdul Ahad Noor. He and Huseyin met in Kashgar during their religious studies.
I like him. He was helpful and then helping others and teaching them.
Abdul Ahad remembered how concerned Huseyin was with China's crackdown on Uyghur Muslims.
He knew that East Turkestani people in danger. Chinese government was deceiving them, cheating them. Chinese government guiding them to danger. Huseyin Celil knew it.
So the Xinjiang region means the new frontier in Chinese. And prior to it being called this, it was often referred to as East Turkestan.
Darren Byler is an anthropologist at Simon Fraser University who spent years doing research in northwest China and on the situation with the Uyghurs.
And so it's right on the border with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. And the Uyghur people speak a language that's very similar to what's spoken in Uzbekistan, the Uzbek language. It's a Turkic language.
According to Darren, the Uyghurs have lived in northwest China for over 1,000 years, along with other East Turkestan peoples.
Their population is around 12 million, around a third of the size of the Canadian population. The space that they live in is a gigantic desert and mountainous region. It's massive space, and they're an indigenous people to that space.
But in 1949, the People's Republic of China renamed the East Turkestan Republic to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And this led to Uyghur activists, professors, poets, and many leaders trying to regain independence in the region. And China began to crack down harsher on the Uyghur Muslims, eventually labeling anyone who advocated for the independence of the Uyghurs as a terrorist.
He used to say, "Hey people, we are sleeping. You should wake up because China is destroying our culture, our language, our background, and then they are destroying our children by birth control. China is robbing our wealth in our country."
By the early 90s, Huseyin became an imam at a local mosque in Kashgar. He'd also been attracting the attention of Chinese police, who'd ordered him to abide by Chinese restrictions on what he could and couldn't say to his congregation. Huseyin often chose to ignore them.
In here, China is killing our people. His speech was like that. He used to warning them about the incoming genocide.
Wow, so he sensed that the situation would get worse.
Yeah, he said if the situation continues like this, our nation will be under genocide around 10 years or 15 years. We need to wake up.
So in general, Islamic learning was something that was illegalized in the 90s.
That's Darren again.
Which meant that most Uyghurs just began to study the Quran and basic sort of instruction in underground ways in their neighborhoods. But, people would know that they're not supposed to talk about that. So in school, if the teacher would ask, are you studying Arabic or learning the Quran, a young Uyghur boy would know, no, of course not. I'm not doing that, when of course they were. So Islamic practice itself, like prayer or fasting, was not okay because there was surveillance going on in the mosque, human surveillance, cameras, and so on.
Things finally came to a head when Huseyin used a megaphone to amplify a call to prayer, a common practice in Muslim countries. He was arrested by Chinese authorities and spent 48 days in prison. Once he was released in 1994, he and his family knew it was time to flee China. Now, China never granted Huseyin a passport, so he had to use a fake one, and there was a thriving black market for them, for Uyghurs trying to escape the country. He was issued a new passport with the Turkish name Guler Dilaver, a name that would later haunt him. With this identity, Huseyin made it only as far as neighboring Kyrgyzstan, but continued his religious sermons. According to a Globe and Mail news report, he was arrested again for, quote, creating hatred among the people. He spent 9 months in a Kyrgyzstan cell awaiting trial, but was eventually acquitted. And Chinese officials were in the courtroom during that hearing. Meanwhile, police in China were doing routine raids on his family home, the family who chose not to flee the country. Every month, police came by and were demanding to know where Huseyin was. Under the name Guler Dilaver, he went to Uzbekistan next. He met a man who offered him shelter among other Uyghurs, and ended up marrying the man's daughter, Kamila Telendabayeva. By 1999, the newlywed couple sought refuge in Turkey and gave birth to their first child, Muhammad. Muhammad was born with physical and mental health problems and required constant support. Huseyin and Kamila knew that they needed stability, healthcare, and a home. So they applied for UNHCR refugee status and were eventually accepted. In the fall of 2001, the Celils were on their way to Canada to start a new life. At that same time, an arrest warrant for Guler Dilaver is issued by Interpol for killing a man in Kyrgyzstan.
This just in, you are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed.
Espera de mayores informaciones, saber qué fue lo que
That looks like a second plane.
And there, as you can see, perhaps the second tower, the front tower, is collapsing. Good Lord.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
The fear from 9/11 reverberated throughout the world, including China. Here's Darren Byler again.
Within 1 month of September 11, October 11, 2001, the Chinese state said, we have terrorists too, and they are Uyghurs. And this was the first time that a Chinese state official had referred to a Chinese citizen as a terrorist. How the figure of the terrorist works in this context is a way of justifying the settler occupation of Uyghur lands, of saying, like, these people that are living here already, they are infected by this foreign Islam, and we need to transform them, make them productive, erase the foreign parts of their lives, and make them compliant, submissive, assimilated Chinese citizens.
Meanwhile, Huseyin and his wife built their life in Canada, learning English, with Huseyin working as a cook and delivery man. They eventually settled in the suburban town of Burlington, Ontario, amid a Turkish community that reminded them of home. By November 2005, things were looking up for the Celils. They both received their Canadian citizenship, Kamila was pregnant with another child, and Huseyin no longer needed the alias Guler Dilaver anymore. He became an imam at the local masjid, or mosque, and went back to advocating against Uyghur persecution in Xinjiang. In his mind, he was a Canadian citizen, and that citizenship protected him from Chinese state punishment. But Kamila, his wife, hadn't seen her family in Uzbekistan for 6 years. She had wanted her parents to meet their grandchildren, especially her mother, who had fallen ill. So Huseyin planned a family visit to Uzbekistan. But some of his friends were warning him that returning to Central Asia wasn't such a good idea.
Like, he's a friend of mine, we were neighbors, and then also he was the imam of a local masjid.
One of them was this man, Burhan Jalik. Before making a decision, Huseyin met Burhan at a local Tim Hortons to discuss the idea of going to Uzbekistan.
He came to me, he said he wants to go to Central Asia. I said, where? He said, maybe to Uzbekistan. I said, why? Because, his wife is from Uzbekistan. She's Uzbek. And I said, look, don't do that. Don't do that.
Burhan explained the risks of going to Uzbekistan, mainly putting him back on China's radar. Even Husein's childhood friend, Abdul Ahad Noor, tried to warn him. Abdul Ahad, who was now residing in Alberta, was speaking from experience. He too fled China for Canada after his family's horrific imprisonment.
Chinese government put my whole family in concentration camps. At that time, my parents, my brothers and sisters, my wife, even my children, 3 siblings, which ages 3, 5 years old children together in concentration camps. And then they killed 2 of them. One was injured. They put my children in water, in a ditch. So I lost my two children in 2006.
The Chinese government doesn't refer to these as concentration camps, but rather vocational centers, with the goal of alleviating poverty and curbing extremism. We reached out to the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Chinese ambassador for comment, but they ignored repeated requests for an interview. Abdul Ahad told Huseyin his story and warned him not to return to the region, even for a family visit.
I talked to him by phone and then I suggested them not to go to Uzbekistan. He said, I don't go to Uzbekistan, maybe I go to Russia, I stay there, maybe my wife go to Uzbekistan. Because he knew that if he go there, it will be a problem. Because he used to live in Uzbekistan, so many times Uzbekistan police tried to capture him, to return him to China.
Despite the warnings, Huseyin ended up going to Uzbekistan. He wanted his in-laws to see their daughter and their grandkids. After all, these were the people who gave him shelter when he was fleeing China.
Huseyin Celil said, right now I'm Canadian, I have Canadian passport, so I am a Canadian citizen. Maybe those countries cannot give me to China because I'm not Chinese anymore. He trusted in Canadian passport, I don't know.
In February of 2006, the Celils landed in Uzbekistan with their new Canadian passports. But for Huseyin, this would be a one-way trip. Towards the end of their visit in Uzbekistan, Huseyin and Camilla's son became sick and needed a little more time to recuperate. So Huseyin, Camilla's father, and brother went to the government office to request a 1-week extension on their visa. At the government office, they're greeted by Uzbek police, and Huseyin is arrested. No one is told why or if there were any charges laid. They would find out months later, and it would have everything to do with Husein's fake alias, Guler Dilaver, and the crimes of terrorism and murder.
It was something around 2, 3 o'clock early in the morning. Somebody talks to me. It sounds like Turkish, but it's not really Turkish.
News of Husein's arrest spread quickly, and even reached his friend in Canada, Burhan.
I said, can you please talk a little bit slower? I don't understand you. And then he said, Huseyin Celil. I said, what happened to him? He said, they got him. I said, they got him? Where? How? Why? I said, who are you?
Camilla remained in Uzbekistan, taking care of their children and desperate for news about Huseyin. She called her friend Nori back in Canada to see if he knew anyone who could help.
I get a phone call from Nuri about 8 p.m. I remember very clearly. I got a call at 8, and Nuri said, Chris, Hussein's being detained. Can you help us? I said, well, absolutely. Come by the house.
Chris McLeod is a commercial litigator at Cambridge LLP in Toronto. He deals mainly in commercial and corporate law, so he never expected to be thrown into an international legal case.
He came by the house. I said, well, this should be simple. We'll just call Ottawa, and he should be out in a couple of days.
Chris called the Department of Foreign Affairs.
And it was pretty clear that they had, at that time, no interest in dealing with us on this file. Ultimately, I wrote a letter and said, I'm representing Huseyin and his family, and we've got information that you need to have to get him out. I received a truly bizarre letter saying, we see no need to meet with you or his wife.
Wow.
Like literally a paragraph, and I'm like, what is this about? Like, I have important information. And by the way, the other point they raised was, well, you can't be retained. Have you met him and signed a retainer with him? I said, he's in prison in Uzbekistan. Of course, I don't have a retainer agreement signed. But I'm raising flags to you. There's a real challenge here.
We asked Chris for a copy of the letter, but he didn't have it anymore. So we can't confirm the details of what was in it. But I was shocked to learn that the Canadian government didn't want to hear more about meeting a Canadian man who was detained. And Chris seemed to think that they were hiding behind a technicality, that he wasn't officially Husein's lawyer. Chris's letter for appeal reached then Prime Minister Stephen Harper, his parliamentary secretary Jason Kenney, and the Secretary General for Amnesty International Canada at that time, Alex Neve.
Well, certainly we were trying to figure out what was going on. It was hard to get clear information.
That's Alex.
I mean, Camilla herself was still in Uzbekistan. I didn't have direct contact with her at that point. And we were just trying to get as much information as we could out of Canadian officials. Were they aware of this? Were they making inquiries? And initially they really weren't.
Alex said that one of the difficulties was that there was no Canadian embassy in Uzbekistan. The closest embassy was in Moscow, Russia, meaning the Canadian government didn't have a direct line of communication with the authorities that held Huseyin.
We all knew that the backdrop to this almost certainly had to be China, and that the real risk was that he was going to end up in China. That's not unusual in Central Asia, especially with Uyghurs. So it wasn't fanciful or alarmist to imagine he's going to be sent to China.
See, Uzbekistan is part of what's called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a political, economic, and security organization created by China to develop stronger bonds to their allies. Their members included Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Their goal is to obliterate terrorism, separatism, and extremism in member states. People like Alex and Chris were worried that this could mean the Chinese state was behind the arrest warrant.
We relayed that information. That was part of the information why we wanted to speak to Global Affairs or Foreign Affairs at the time and said, we've got information that could be valuable. We have a Canadian citizen detained. He's nothing to do with Uzbekistan and everything to do with China. If he ever gets back to China, we've got real problems.
So at that point, how much did you know about his arrest? Like, did you know what allegations?
Zero. Nobody did. He was just detained on a red notice.
A red notice is basically a request to law enforcement around the world to locate and arrest a person, and possibly await an extradition. So in your mind, what
could it have been?
Yeah.
I didn't know, zero clue. Confusion, misunderstanding. He's there with his wife and 3 children, and Camilla's 9 months pregnant.
About 10 days after Huseyin was arrested, Camilla had to return home to Canada to give birth to their child.
She's now had that child. That child has not met his father, who was born when she returned from Uzbekistan.
After the arrival of her child, Camilla immediately began appealing to the Canadian government and the press to help release Huseyin. We asked Camilla if she would speak to us. She initially agreed, but then went MIA. Here's a clip of her.
I haven't seen him. I haven't talked to him. How am I gonna have a chance to meet with him? So where is he? Is he alive or what? That's what, my big concern.
The first acknowledgement Canada got on Husein's detention came from a statement from Uzbek authorities on June 26, 2006. The Uzbek police claimed that someone named Guler Dilaver was wanted for a murder and a terrorist act in Kyrgyzstan in the year 2000. They said they had reason to believe that Guler Dilaver and Huseyin Celil were the same person. This statement was also the first time Uzbek authorities told Canadian officials that Huseyin Celil had been extradited to China.
Oh, I think we were all incredibly despairing when we learned that he was in China. And it was hard to get clear information about that because, one of the many challenges once someone is in detention on the Chinese side is there is a complete lack of transparency. So there's no public acknowledgement that he's in detention. I don't even remember how long it was before we were getting clear acknowledgement from the Chinese government.
Extradition, according to the Legal Information Institute, is the removal of a person, typically referred to as a fugitive, from a requested jurisdiction to another jurisdiction for criminal prosecution or punishment. While extradition is the term famously used in Husein's case, it's a bit of a red herring.
Well, this is absolutely not an extradition. An extradition would have been a transparent, fully above-board legal process which Huseyin himself would have been able to participate in and defend himself. There would have been a clear, accessible, transparent legal request from the Chinese government, which Huseyin Celil would have seen as to why China was seeking his return to China. On what basis, to face what charges. We're not even remotely in that universe, let alone partially down that road. You could maybe say it was an illegal deportation, but it's all about secrecy. It's all about absolutely no legal process. And you can be rest assured that there will be human rights violations at every step of the way.
Calling it extradition affirms Huseyin Celil has committed something illegal. The question is, did he? On February 2nd, 2007, in a secret location in the city of Urumqi, the trial began. It's unclear who China was putting on trial. Guler Dilaver, the alleged murderer and terrorist, or Huseyin Celil, the outspoken Uyghur imam.
Well, ultimately, I think there was word that there was a trial going on. How that, I think there was a listing. They checked every day to see when it was on. The Canadian government actually sent somebody to reside and follow it there.
So they were there specifically to follow?
Exactly. They went every day to the courthouse, saw that it was on, and weren't allowed in.
A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson later confirmed that the Chinese government considered Huseyin a Chinese citizen. Therefore, none of the rights given to Canadians would apply. This meant Huseyin was on his own during the trial for his life. Now, we don't know what went on during that trial. Family wasn't allowed in, and no lawyers or Canadian consular officials either. But the family was allowed into the sentencing hearing. Here, Huseyin Celil was sentenced to death. According to his family present at the sentencing hearing, Huseyin shouted that he was innocent. "All of it is lies," he said. "I didn't do such things. I've been wronged." His mother, Shalahan Spander, almost fainted when she heard the sentence. Huseyin begged for permission to meet his family for a moment, but was refused, and they were prohibited from speaking to him. His family remembers Huseyin being tearful as he bowed his head. His Chinese court-appointed lawyer also attended the sentencing, but was not allowed to speak.
There's zero proof anywhere that he's done anything with a terrorist intent. They tried to suggest he was...
someone named Guler Dilaver.
Yeah. Zero evidence of that.
The Chinese government said it believed that Guler Dilaver and Huseyin Celil were the same person. Their evidence was that they had the same fingerprints.
Frankly, no one internationally, whether it's the U.S. House of Representatives that's called for his release and return, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or the Canadian government at the highest levels, have ever put any credence on that. He's not a terrorist by any stretch. He was an activist for culture and language, but he's not a terrorist, and was engaged in none of the activities that they're trying to suggest he was.
Chris, along with many others, believe that the only similarity between Huseyin Celil and Guler Dilaver is that Huseyin was given that name on a fake passport while in Kyrgyzstan. The Uzbekistan statement claims that the assassination and terrorist attack took place in the year 2000, where Huseyin would have already been in Turkey with his wife Camilla, so the timelines just don't check out.
The decision came down, and then we actually retained a lawyer and appealed. only because, not because we thought there would be a fair and just appeal process, but we thought it would give China a way out after having convicted him to death in the trial. That maybe reason might prevail and you could show your system was just by using the appeal court to get him out, right?
Chris's appeal and his hope in the Chinese judicial system had both failed. Suddenly, everyone realized they weren't going to succeed in helping Huseyin through the formal proper channels.
But look, the only entity making those charges is a government that has completely violated the rule of law. And there is a complete absence of the rule of law. So, right? And he's sentenced to death by the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury were all the same, and no one was allowed in the room. The Canadian government sent representatives to the courthouse every single day, and they were barred from entry to watch in the courtroom. So if there was a legitimate trial or charge to be had, why wasn't there open and fair trial to deal with it?
But on April 19th, 2007, there was a development. Huseyin Celil's death sentence was changed to a life sentence. This was credited to some backroom dealings between Canada and China, but no details were ever released. More on that later in the series.
Just, it happened. It was commuted to life.
And what was your reaction to that?
Well, it was a small victory. We'll take them where they come.
Prior to Huseyin's sentencing, there was a confession statement signed by Huseyin, confessing to crimes of terrorism and splitting the country.
Give me a break. The Canadian government isn't even allowed to view the trial, but we're told afterwards, oh, here's a confession he signed. Okay, so why are we not allowed consular access? What about independent legal counsel? Like, give me a break. The prosecutor is his counsel. The judge is the prosecutor and his counsel. And all of a sudden we have a confession? I mean, this is out of the movies. You'd have to have a straw for a brain to think that this was a legitimate confession.
Huseyin's mother, who at the time was able to visit him in jail, told family and friends, quote, they forced him to sign a confession or he would be put in a hole and buried alive.
I've no doubt something along those lines has occurred.
Chris tried to appeal the life sentence as well, but the appeal is dismissed in a hearing that lasts only 40 minutes. For Camilla, Chris, and everyone else rooting for Huseyin, it was just a relief that he was going to live.
But frankly, I'm not surprised because he's worth more alive than dead to them. Sending a message to the community, varieties of ways. Sending a message to the diaspora saying, look, watch what you say, because you can get in trouble back home. And even if you don't come back, we can find you.
Huseyin remained in jail, and the political pressure from Canada started to fade. Canadian officials had been pressing the Chinese government to reveal the location of where Huseyin was being imprisoned, but they wouldn't budge. Then came a break. A letter Huseyin wrote reached his mother and was sent to the Globe and Mail, a Canadian newspaper, who translated it to English and published it. This was the first communication from Huseyin that anyone had received since that fateful day he was arrested in Uzbekistan. It's a long and heartfelt letter about his unjust imprisonment, how he misses his family and kids, and how sorry he is for the pain they are feeling in his absence. At the very end of the letter, he signs, Huseyin Celil, March 10th, 2008, number 55 sector, number 6 district, number 1 prison in Urumqi. At long last, Huseyin's prison location in China was revealed. He was alive, and now his family knew exactly where he was. After the letter was published, Huseyin's case started to fade from the public consciousness again. That was until another development came on February 1st, 2016. News broke that a Chinese court had adjusted his sentence from life to 20 years.
But in China, once it's commuted to the 20-year sentence, the sentence starts afresh for 20 years.
9 years that counted for nothing. Huseyin would have to begin a new 20-year sentence. In total, if Huseyin is to serve his full sentence, he will have been in prison for 29 years. You might be wondering why China would reduce the sentence of an alleged terrorist. In any part of the world, there's always one major reason why prisoners either get released early or have their sentences reduced: good behavior. In Huseyin's case, it was in the form of a statement of remorse. In February of 2016, 11 people, all with crimes against the state, had sentence reductions. Huseyin was one of them. Chinese media released a statement read by Huseyin himself. Here's some of the things he said. Oh, and it's worth noting that news sites say that their own staff have edited Huseyin's words. They get bylines for it at the end of the letter. My name is Huseyin Celil. I'm 48 this year. When I was 20, I started blindly collecting and reading through all sorts of illegal literature, taking in the religious extremist ideology that was being propagated inside. I also took advantage of my position at the mosque that I presided over, using all sorts of means to spread my extremist thoughts and feelings of dissatisfaction towards the government to the pious masses. When I first started serving my sentence, I didn't at all recognize the grave consequences of my criminal actions, but the people's police at the prison would explain things over and over, and I came to understand my criminal acts from the legal perspective. The knots in my head became undone as I felt myself waking from a nightmare. In addition to speaking about my experience at the number 1 prison where I am serving, I speak at other prisons also, expressing my remorse. The results of my reform have been recognized, and I have received the Great Meritorious Service Award. It is from the bottom of my heart that I thank the party and government that has cared for me, that has educated me, and that has guided me towards a new life. Have you been in communication with Huseyin? When was the last time you were in communication, and what was the communication?
I've never, other than prior to his leaving for Uzbekistan. So the last time I would have spoken to him, and it'd be just casually at a picnic. The last time Camilla saw or spoke to him was when he left to go pick up the passports from the Uzbek office to get the renewed visas.
So you or Camilla have not spoken to him?
No.
Even since?
Zero.
Not even a phone call?
Zero. Nor a letter. Zero.
Who has spoken to him?
Family of his that's still in northwestern China.
And they were able to see him?
Yeah. Prior to the lockdown in 2015. And they may have seen him since, but there's been no communication between. There was a complete shutdown when the lockdown on the Uyghur region occurred. So we don't know if they've seen him or they haven't. Camilla certainly hasn't had communication with the family. We lost all communication with his family who had been seeing him.
As of recording this in 2024, there has been no official update on Huseyin Celil for 7 years. And that brings us to today. Like I said at the start of this, our goal is to attempt to learn anything about his status, where he is, what has happened to him, and if he is alive or dead. Where do you even start to look? Well, we know one crucial piece of information, his last known jail location, the number 1 prison in Urumqi. That's where we'll start. Next time on Extradition.
I mean, Xinjiang prison, it's the central prison in Xinjiang. That's where the most high-profile detainees are.
Just imagine, Celil is inside. You will lose your hope.
We did a reconstruction of one of the camps to sort of talk about what life was like inside there.
They'll go to great lengths to try to hide it.
They used electric stick to get my confession. It is a really painful memory. It's really sad and it's really hard to describe.
I think there was forced labor going on there.
If you were in our position, what would you do?
I would find the Chinese speakers and call the prison. Let me just see this document that we got, because I think some of them might even have phone numbers.
Extradition is written and produced by me, Yusuf Zine, and Kevin Young. Tiffany Lamb is our producer and editor for TVO Today podcasts. Kevin Young is also our audio engineer. Our story editor is Michelle Shepard. Our legal counsel is Willa Marcus. Production support from Jonathan Hallowell, Ariana Longley, Vito Tagarelli, Jeff Kusura, and Jennifer DeRosa. Artwork by Jasmine L. Kurd. Katie O'Connor is managing editor for podcasts and digital video at TVO Today. Our executive producer of digital for TVO Today is Lori Few. John Ferry is vice president of programming and content for TVO Today. Theme song and music by Blue Dot Sessions and Audio Network. Extradition is produced by Innerspeak and TVO Today.